Welcome to This Is Not About Your Body, where we talk about all the real shit body image issues are actually about, because they're never just about the way you look. I am your host, Jessie Nealand, and today I have with me Dr. Alexis Conason, who is a New York City-based clinical psychologist, certified eating disorder specialist and supervisor, creator of the anti-diet plan Mindful Eating program, and author of the book, The Diet-Free Revolution, 10 Steps to Free Yourself from the Diet Cycle with Mindful Eating and Radical Self-Acceptance. I have been following and admiring Alexis's Instagram account for years. It's a popular one called The Anti-Diet Plan. And I'm thrilled to have her on here to talk about diet culture and mindful eating. So welcome, Alexis.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. So let's start with the basics. As a psychologist and eating disorder specialist, who do you work with, and what is it that they're usually coming to you for help with?
So I personally specialize in working with people mostly with binge eating disorder and disordered eating. So a lot of people kind of stuck on the chronic dieting, on the wagon, off the wagon types of cycles. A lot of people struggling with body image issues, feeling unhappy with their body. And I have a group practice. So in my practice, the therapists work with really the full range of different types of eating disorders and disordered eating.
Yeah. For listeners who maybe don't know the difference, could you give a definition between eating disorders and disordered eating? I feel like that's kind of an interesting one clinically.
Yeah, so eating disorders I think of as kind of the categories designated in the DSM. And for those not familiar, the DSM is kind of like the psychiatric Bible where psychiatrists and therapists go to make diagnoses for any kind of mental health conditions. And unfortunately, diagnoses, I mean, that could be a whole other
Yeah.
talk, but it's very limited, and all the biases that are baked into our culture are baked into the DSM. So who meets those DSM diagnoses is not always reflective of like who's struggling and who really would benefit from treatment. So I think of disordered eating as kind of like the broader umbrella of people who are struggling with some kind of issues around food and eating, but they may not meet one of those criteria, and that doesn't mean that therapy or treatment isn't really beneficial.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you. Okay, so I want to talk about your book, and I realized I talk a lot on here. I mean, I would be shocked if any of my listeners were not familiar with diet culture as a topic. But I would, in order just to kind of get everybody on the same page, I would love to hear you give a definition for how you use this term or what you mean when you use it, because it's obviously such a major part of your book and your work.
Yeah. So when I think about diet culture, I think about just kind of our culture, like what we are all immersed in. And it's a culture that tells us that there's one certain way that's acceptable to look, there's one certain picture of health. It tells us that we have to be healthy and beautiful and desirable in order to be valuable and acceptable in our society. All of those things, like when we talk about diet culture, it's really kind of like a coming together of a lot of different systems. Kind of all
Yeah,
melted into one.
totally. I also feel like there's, depending on where you're coming in from, one or both might be major players in your experience of body image. But I feel like there's like the two major branches that people tend to come into diet culture from, either the health standpoint or the appearance or beauty standpoint. That like some people will say, oh, I don't care about looking attractive, I just want to be healthy. And I'm like, still diet culture. And then there's people who are like, it's like straight up just about how I look, still diet culture. So could you give some examples of the messages that most of us have learned, or yeah, like some of the most prominent diet culture messages?
Yeah, and I will say just on that note, like I think there's been a real shift from the way that diet culture presented itself, for example, when I was growing up in like the 1990s to now. And I think that in that shift, it's become less kind of socially acceptable to say that you want to lose weight because of your appearance, and more socially
Yes,
acceptable to say that you want to lose weight about health. So I think that
that's so
as a
true.
society, we've kind of like merged away from this idea of, again, when I was growing up, it was very prominent to kind of, just say like, I want six pack abs and I want, the whatever. And now it's become, like healthy is the new skinny, but it's still the
Yeah.
same old diet culture messages.
That's so true. And also like the changes to certain things like Weight Watchers and Noom and like there's such a push to be like, we're not diets because clearly diets have become kind of a dirty word. It's been tainted. Whereas, yeah, definitely when I was growing up as well, it was like that was so like nobody would ever question that of course you were dieting. Of course you wanted to diet.
Yeah, exactly. But in terms of what you asked before with some like the common things that we hear about diet culture, I mean, I think could be anything from even just like the messages that we should, be a certain size in order to be able to access clothing in like a brick and mortar shop, or that, if we don't fit into the tiny like plane seats, that's something wrong with our body. Like that's all diet culture. I think the messaging around health and that we have to be a certain weight in order to be healthy is definitely coming from diet culture, and all these ideals around beauty and desirability and acceptability also come in through diet culture.
Yeah. And how do you understand, or if, sort of tracking a little bit of how your book presents it, how do you understand the role of diet culture in disordered eating and eating disorders? Like, how do you conceptualize the overlap or the journey that people might take through these?
Yeah, so I think that dieting and diet culture starts to disconnect us from our body. So, oftentimes, like from a very young age, we start to receive and internalize messages that there's something wrong with us, that we're not good enough, that we need to change our body in order to be okay. And through that, we often start to mistrust our body, to feel that our body's bad in some way, that we need to change our body, that we need to fight against like the natural signals that we're getting from our body. And that is, I think, a big juncture of where the eating disorder path can start, where we
Yeah.
start neglecting to hear, okay, I'm hungry, but I shouldn't be hungry. I shouldn't eat now. I shouldn't feed myself. I'm going to see if I can go longer without eating. Or, it just starts to disrupt like the whole hunger, fullness, appetite cycle, which is really like an amazing thing that's hardwired into our body,
Yeah.
but it gets so disrupted.
Yeah. I am curious to hear, like, have you ever come across someone with an eating disorder who did not have diet culture as one of like the big influences leading them to it? Like can we or can a person develop disordered eating or eating disorders without this influence?
So I think that's a complicated question. I don't know if it's possible to answer since we're all in
Yeah,
diet culture, and I think diet
right,
culture influences all of us. At least like the folks that I work with here, in the U.S. and in New York. I we know that most people who go on a diet do not necessarily go on to develop eating disorders. And we also
right,
know that most people with eating disorders have a history of dieting. So, we know eating disorders is, multifactorial. We know there's biological components, there's genetic components, there's environmental components, and certainly diet culture is one component. But yeah, I think it's hard to parse out because diet culture is
right.
just so pervasive. I don't know if I know anyone who hasn't been impacted by diet culture.
Yeah,
So
we
of
don't
course
have a
everyone with
control
eating.
group to find out.
Yeah, exactly.
I asked because I think like the disconnect that you're talking about, it feels so in my book, Body Neutral, I talk a lot about the undue significance or meaning that gets put on our bodies. And it also gets put on, the cues from our bodies and exercise and food and all these other things that are sort of related to it. And when you have an inappropriate amount of significance and power being given to something, even if it's just like a hunger or fullness cue, it gets really weird really quickly. It's very difficult to just kind of carry on with your day when you've been told these things matter more than other things. And it's like, that's where the distortion starts to happen. So I'm often curious, like, is it possible, I guess, yeah, we don't have a control group to find out. Is it possible to go on and have all of these compulsive patterns and disorders without having first interrupted or put this like inappropriate amount of power on certain signals, certain feelings, certain activities, choices, all the stuff that diet culture kind of puts us in that position. Even just literally by talking about weight, like immediately food now takes on an inappropriate amount of power.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we know again, there's people have different journeys in terms of the development of eating disorders, and there are different things that can set it off. I've worked with a number of clients who've had their eating disorder set off by, medical things and kind of like having to restrict for
Yeah.
different medical issues and things like that. So I think it'd be complicated, but again, it's really hard to parse out because like we're all in it. So I don't
Yeah.
know how you can see look at
Right,
someone
right.
who's not in it.
Okay, so take me back to the thing about disconnecting from your body. So diet culture encourages us to well, I don't know, in my generation, it encouraged us to follow like magazine articles and,
Mhm.
whatever books maybe about how to eat. So it basically said you are not a trustworthy source of information about what you can eat, what you should eat, how much you should eat, when you should eat. But like this person is, so follow their rules. Uh, what happens then? What's the impact on a person who has been taught to mistrust their own signals, disconnect from or stop listening to their signals, and try to follow some sort of external rule system?
Yeah, so essentially we start to, you know, like you're saying, not trust our own body, and we start to think that we need some outside set of guidance to tell us what and how to eat. So we start to basically try to transfer something that's governed, our appetite regulation system is governed by like very primitive parts of our brain because it is hardwired to like keep us alive. It's a basic survival mechanism by encouraging us to eat, and helping us to understand what foods are safe, what foods are going to be
Yeah.
nourishing. So we basically try to like override that very primitive part of our brain and transfer it to like the executive functioning part of our brain, where we're now trying to say, I'm going to eat according to rules, I'm going to use discipline, I'm going to use motivation. These are not effective ways to manage our appetite. And what tends to happen is that people start to feel very out of control with our eating because we feel like we're kind of
Yeah.
grasping on for dear life to these set of rules to try to feel in control about something that inherently we feel very out of control about because we're not supposed to control our appetite.
Right.
Like, it's like trying to say, I'm going to stop breathing. It's not in our control because our body is designed to breathe to keep us alive and similar
Yeah.
to eating. So, oftentimes we start to feel more and more out of control. People think that they need more rules, they need more restrictions, they need more discipline. And it can really set off the spiral where people find themselves in very dangerous places.
Yeah, I feel like that's such a perfect analogy about breathing too, because we could control our breathing. Let's say instead of diet culture, we had like oxygen culture or something, and it was like, absolutely told from the beginning that the disciplined, good, hardworking people controlled how much air they took in every day. Like we could spend our whole lives tracking, managing, obsessing over, and trying to use discipline and willpower for how many breaths we took per day. It sounds like a shitty life, but it's the same thing with food. It's
Mhm.
moving it from like that was supposed to just take place without we've got our brain power for other things.
Mhm.
And the same is true with food. It wasn't ever supposed to be in the front of mind like this.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so what do you do with people who come in? Let's say they've been dieting for a really long time or they've been in a disordered place for a long time. So they're like, I have no idea what I feel. I have no idea when I'm hungry or full. The whole thing is very chaotic and confusing. How do you help them in that space? Because I feel like it's very easy and some, sort of well-meaning internet wisdom is like, just listen to your body. And a lot of people are like, cool, I don't know what it's saying.
Yeah. And I think that's one of the things that people feel really overwhelmed with. And so many people, when they start to heal from diet culture, they're really like looking on Instagram, they're looking on social media, they're getting these tidbits, and they're like, okay, I know I'm not supposed to diet anymore, but what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
I have so many people who message me on social media and they're like, I tried not dieting, I tried intuitive eating, it doesn't work. I'm like, what did you try? Oh, I listened to this person, on
Yeah.
Instagram or whatever. And it's we think about how we got to where we are. And, just like reading a few Instagram posts is not necessarily going to
Right.
help us out. But um, what I find in my practice is that when people come in, they often feel overwhelmed. They don't know what to do. They feel lost. They feel scared without the rules of diet culture. And what we need is, a kind of containment to help them find a way back to connecting with their body. And I have found mindfulness and mindful eating to be really powerful here. And, using mindfulness meditation, we can help people be more present in their bodies and with the kind of hearing the guidance that their body is telling them. And I also find that it kind of provides some structure and like support for people in those early stages.
Yeah. Can you give us a definition of mindful eating?
Sure. Yeah. So mindful eating is based on mindfulness meditation, which is the idea of being fully aware and present in the current moment with a sense of non-judgmental awareness and acceptance. And then we take that idea and apply it to food and our eating. So being fully present in our eating experiences and being fully present in our body with, hearing those signals that our body is telling us, and not only being present, but trying to meet those experiences with a sense of non-judgmental observation and acceptance. So kind of being curious about the things that come up, having compassion towards yourself when you're struggling, all of that is part of mindful eating.
Yeah. So how does someone get started? Do you feel like it has to be alongside a meditation type practice, or do you have some people who just apply it to eating?
So I definitely think that having a meditation practice makes it a lot easier. It's the mindfulness practice is what helps kind of build those pathways in our brain that help us be more present and aware in the current moment. So without that, it's kind of like you're trying to, skip to, the third step without doing one and two.
Yeah.
Um, some people are really adverse to meditation, and that's okay.
That's what I was gonna ask about, yeah.
Yeah, like I'm a big fan. I mean, I start people off with very brief periods of meditation. So I don't think meditation has to be something that's done perfectly. There's also a lot of misinformation about mindfulness and about meditation. Like a lot of people think that they're not good at meditating or they can't meditate because they can't clear their mind. And mindfulness is actually not
Yeah.
about clearing your mind at all. It's just about observing what is on your mind. So if you're distracted, if you're having other thoughts, like that's totally fine. That's part of
Yeah.
the process. But I usually start people off with like a 3-minute period of meditation. And I find that's something that's doable. And like most of us can find 3 minutes to fit this into our day. So I don't want to
Yeah.
say that, it's you can't eat mindfully at all, but I think it's a very different experience developing a mindfulness practice and understanding what it really means to sit and be present outside of our relationship with food. It's also being mindful during eating for people who are struggling, with issues around food. That's like a much more difficult time to be present. So if we can start building those
Right.
skills with just being present with our breath, being present with what's it like to really like observe washing our hands, during the day, what's it like to fully be present with like a piece of music and hear all the notes and the
Yeah.
sounds. Like that's, a different experience and a lot more manageable for people.
Totally. Yeah, I would agree that there's a lot of misinformation. I feel like I had already read a bunch of books by the time I like had a meditation teacher basically tell me that I wasn't bad at it, that's the whole point. And I was like, "What? How is that possible?" Like I definitely had the idea of sitting down and being like, "I'm supposed to have a clear head and I suck at this." Um okay, so when we're talking about mindful eating then, if a person's mindful meditation or practice or whatever sort of leading into it is about watching their thoughts, how do you sort of instruct or guide someone? Like, what are they watching when they eat? Is it their thoughts or is there other information that they're watching and being present with?
It's both. So the idea, and it sounds like a lot to hold in the beginning, and then as we practice, it becomes really like second nature where we're not thinking about
Mhm.
all of the different components. But, I think it's about noticing what thoughts and feelings come up when we're eating, also noticing as much as we can about the experience with food. So noticing the smell of the food, the
Yeah.
taste, the texture, and then also noticing what's going on with our body. Are we hungry? Are we full? Are we getting satisfied? Is the taste enjoyable? Does the taste enjoyment change as we're eating? So noticing all of those things, and then noticing, are there thoughts or feelings coming up? I shouldn't be eating this. I should be eating this. What's wrong with me that I'm still eating and everyone else is finished? All of those kinds of things to
Right.
observe as well.
And then what? If someone's having a lot of anxious stuff come up, what's the next step in the process to watch it and be like, "Yep, I'm freaking out."
Yeah. I mean, I think there's so much to be said for just observing and being aware of things. Once we're able to say, whoa, I'm freaking out right now, or
Yeah.
like, there's a lot coming up, or, just labeling like, this is making me really anxious, we're able to work with those thoughts and feelings in a different way. So,
Yeah.
when we're able to say, you know, I'm having a lot of diet culture thoughts coming in right now, or I'm having a lot of anxiety right now, we're able to pause, reflect, okay, what do I need in this moment? How can I move forward in a different
Yeah.
way? Versus when those thoughts and feelings are just happening largely like outside of our awareness, we can't really intervene at all. We're just kind of more on autopilot.
Yeah, totally. Gives you like the tiniest bit of spaciousness where there wasn't before.
Exactly.
Also, I feel like as a verbal processor, one of the most helpful tools for me in meditation was being able to name what was coming up and then let it go. So I would be like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm spiraling. Oh, I'm anxious. I'm attaching to something. This is a judgment. This, like just being able to name those things for me was so much relief. And I see that in a lot of my verbal processing type clients as well, that
Hmm.
like not everybody loves to give it a title or a container, but I do. And some of us
Yeah.
really do. Just to be like,
Yeah.
oh, I
No.
understand what's going on.
Yeah, and that's a strategy I use a lot with my clients. And I do
Mm.
think it's really helpful to be able to, just label and then kind of let it go. And I would say if it's something important, it will come back. Like you're not going to lose
Oh,
anything.
yeah. That's so true.
But yeah, I think that being able to give it a label, especially during meditation, where we're not going to be doing anything, if you're sitting and meditating, you're having thoughts coming up, like we're not going to be acting on those thoughts in that moment. So sometimes just
Yeah.
noticing, I'm feeling anxious right now. I think it really can be a gift almost, that
Yeah.
labeling, because it allows us to have more insight into what's going on in those moments. And oftentimes, I know for myself, I've left a meditation practice and I'd be like, oh wow, like I'm feeling really anxious this morning and I wasn't even aware of it before I sat down on the cushion.
Right. Which I do feel like when you've named it in that way, it's hard not to feel a little bit more compassionate towards yourself,
Mm-hmm.
because recognizing, oh, I'm anxious this morning, it immediately you're like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
baby. Like,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to everything is wrong this morning?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I know that your book is sort of broken up into sections. Could you walk us through the like unfolding or the structure of your book so that someone who's kind of going into this can understand like what this process looks like?
Yeah, so I wrote my book. My book is also based on the group program that I read for many years that I practice and
Mm.
is now an online course. And I really started to think about, what are the things that are coming up for my clients that I'm kind of, the universals in working with people. And of course, there's no absolute universals. Everyone is so different. But I do find that in my work with clients, there were some things that I found came up over and over and over again. And I started to think about kind of what are the things that the tools that people, that are helpful to people as they're moving away from diet culture. So I
Yeah.
think the first thing, and this is the first part of my book, is starting to know, that about diet culture, right? Because if we're not aware, we can't do anything.
Yeah.
So kind of like, what is diet culture? Why is it harmful? And the first two chapters of my book are really focused on that. Not
Yeah.
only what is diet culture and why is it harmful, but also why so much of what we've been taught about the connection between weight and health is actually not accurate.
Right.
So I have a research background. I'm someone who likes to see like the data and the
Love
science.
that.
So I really kind of go into a lot of the research. Like that's what was convincing to me on my journey. So if other
Same.
people, need that, that's all there in that, like the first two chapters of the book.
Yeah.
And then I started to think about how to develop develop the tools. So kind of the basics of mindful eating, developing a meditation practice, how to recognize hunger and fullness, how to
Mm.
recognize taste of food and how taste changes over time,
Mm.
and how to make choices around food, because that's another thing that I think people get really overwhelmed with.
Yeah.
What am I supposed to eat? And when we've been listening to diet culture for so much of our lives to tell us what to eat, it can be hard to start to trust our bodies again and start to hear,
Yeah.
what kinds of foods we find enjoyable and what kinds of foods like work well in our body as well. So
Yeah.
kind of focusing on that. And then, yeah.
I just wanted to hear more about the taste thing, but keep going. I'll ask after.
Yeah. Well, and as I was saying, and then the last part of the book is kind of, that last phase or one of the later phases, which is, once we're starting to feel better around our relationship with food, how do we want to spend, that time in our lives? So like how to bring in
Ooh,
more pleasure into our lives, how
love
to
that.
build meaningful relationships, to, kind of live in alignment with our values. So that's some of the end part.
Yes. I love that. Also, I feel like people going into it really do not expect the kind of catastrophic identity shift that happens when you've been thinking about food your whole life and then aren't. You're like, who am I? What do I do with this life now?
Exactly. And
It's major.
that's that last, the last one or two chapters is really to kind of help people, that I find that I see a lot in my practice, that people start struggling with like, who am I
Yeah.
outside of, dieting? Who am I outside of this person who's been obsessed with health all my life?
Yeah.
It really can be an identity shift.
Totally. Okay, so take me back to the taste thing because I'm curious
Yeah.
about that, and I certainly haven't talked about that on here. So, what is it when you say helping people tune into taste? Does that mean that they were tuned out during dieting or eating disorder spaces?
Yeah, I think many people are tuned out from the taste of food. We tend to kind of eat and not really be present with like
Mm,
what's actually happening. So, especially for people who struggle with binge eating, oftentimes where,
of course.
people are kind of like having a bite of food and then, it's off, and it's like almost can be a dissociative experience where,
Yeah.
we really aren't attuned. But I think it's for everyone. We tend to naturally, most people will pay attention to the first bite of food, like the taste of the first bite. And again, from an evolutionary perspective, we're hardwired to be very attentive to the first bite of food, because that's what told us like if something's poisonous or not. So something
Ah,
tastes sweet, something tastes delicious, we know it's like safe to eat.
huh.
um, so we do, most people naturally are more kind of attentive to that first bite, but then we're like, okay, yes, it's safe, it's delicious, it's fine, and then we
Right.
tune out. And what many people don't realize is actually the taste of food changes over time. It's related to our satiety signals. So when we're very hungry, the taste of food tends to be like kick off more of the reward signals in our brain. And then as we start to get satisfied, our body is sending us the signals, like we don't need to continue eating to fill our
Yeah.
nutritional needs. And the taste tends to change to reflect that.
Yeah. I love that fact because I feel like it's one of the things that makes it so undeniable that our body is telling us what to do all the time.
Mhm.
Like, it makes food taste better when you need food. It makes food stop tasting so good when you're done. What an absolute genius mechanism.
Mhm.
And it's
Mhm.
true in so many things, right? You're like, God, a glass of water sounds amazing right now when you're thirsty. But then let's say you just chugged a bunch, you're like, "Bleh, get it away from me." Like
Mhm.
your body's constantly talking to you. And I feel like that fact of like satiety and like the pleasure of taste changing over the course of a meal is huge.
Yeah.
Okay, so in this process, what kind of obstacles do you tend to see? Like, are there major roadblocks for people at different stages? Do you feel like there's, like you talked about towards the end, sort of the identity crisis or even social role shifting? Like, if everyone knows you as, you know, a healthy girl, now you're somebody
Mhm.
else. There's a lot to rebuild there. Are there similar um, commonalities for people along the rest of the journey that they run into or have to deal with?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the hardest obstacle for people I have found is moving away from diet culture. So
Mm,
I think a lot of people come in, they may have an awareness that dieting isn't helping them, or they have an awareness that like diet culture is contributing to their eating issues. But to truly move away from diet culture in terms of accepting that, stopping, like letting go of trying to control your body, the way that your body looks, your body shape and size. I think that's the hardest thing for people, and that connection with health as well. People are so afraid of, um, like trusting their body
yeah.
and just, whatever is going to happen in that process. I find that's where people get really stuck. I find, a lot of people come in and they're like, I'm ready to try mindful eating. I want to move away from dieting, but I also still want to lose weight. So, and that's a
Yeah.
very,
Yeah.
I mean, that's where people are. And, we always start there,
Of
but
course.
it's hard to truly eat mindfully when we're also kind of still afraid of what does it mean if I want a second ice cream pop, or if, what does it mean
Right.
if I want, X, Y, or Z that I've been so indoctrinated to believe like are bad foods. I shouldn't eat those. I think that
Yeah.
that's what I see as the hardest piece for people, and the connection with health as well, right? Like a lot of people say like, well, I don't mind, if
Yeah.
I gain weight, for what I look like, but like I just want to be healthy, right? And but then
Yeah.
when they say healthy, it's really associated with losing weight.
Totally. I see that as well. That is really, really major and time consuming. I think people,
Mhm.
well, in a quick fix economy, we're all like 6 weeks to food freedom or
Mhm.
whatever, and people are like, "Great, let me get this done." But if it took you, 4 decades to get here, it's not going to be done in 6 weeks.
Yeah, I think it's really hard too when we've learned that our value is associated with, looking a certain way, or, whatever, however health gets in there as
Yeah,
well, to let go of that. And to, many people, like, we've been raised, rewarded for losing weight. We've been, it's so complex for people.
definitely. Yeah. And I think something I've been obsessing over lately, I've been creating this course, Fuck the Patriarchy. So there's just like a lot in there about coercion and what is a choice that's freely made versus coerced. And does an individual have to be coercing you for you to be coerced? And the answer, of course, is no, because we live in a culture that has created a coercive environment for a lot of choices that we're like, I just want to do this for me. But actually, all of that context sits on your shoulders as you make this freely made choice to try to lose weight or whatever. It really wasn't freely made because you were told there are majorly negative consequences that you have to avoid here, and you'll be rewarded and celebrated if you do it right.
And I want to emphasize also that we
Yeah.
live in a culture that has created very real consequences for
Yes.
people, in larger bodies. So, like, it may, I get it. I get the
Yeah.
hesitation of to give up that sense of control. It's scary.
Totally.
Yeah. But the
Okay.
control is all an illusion also, right? Because I think the more that we
Right.
try to control our eating, the more out of control we tend to feel.
So true. I feel sometimes like on the other side of this whole journey, that I eat like whatever, and I certainly get some odd comments, or, people just think I eat strangely, and that's fair. I'll give it to them. But like it is very much because I'm aware of like if in a moment that I want a very random thing, even the thought of that's not how we eat, like even that it's just it takes you down the path again of there's a right and a wrong. And I think, there's so much freedom in eating kind of weird sometimes because it gets you completely away from these are uh these are sort of moralized choices, or these are choices that have bigger meaning. It's yeah, it's super super freeing. I mean, obviously that's the whole point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sure you come across this in your work. I certainly do, which is the idea that we have these statistics out there in anti-diet material. It's often floated, diets don't work, what, like 95% of the time. The number can bounce around, but essentially, many people hear that and go, great, then I'm going to have to work really hard to be a part of the 5%. So I'm curious what you say to people, because I think it's one of those things where I'm like, the statistic matters. It's important and we need to have it out there, but it's fascinating how that gets distorted into then I need to be extra special to be a part of this tiny elite force of people who succeed. How do you help people through that?
It's really interesting. I mean, this isn't exactly answering your question, but I think it's there, researchers tried to understand this. There's a lot of research on what are those 5% of people who are, successful
Yeah.
dieters. And if you look at the data, there's a really interesting study that came out looking at the data from the National Weight Control Registry, which is like where they've actually told people, that kind of elusive 5%, to fill out all these questionnaires and to study like what are they doing to be successful, quote unquote successful,
Yeah.
where all these other people, the other 95% of the population isn't. And what they find is that those people report engaging in behaviors that are very similar to what you see in people with severe chronic and enduring anorexia. Right. So those two, of course, are not, at least in the study, they're not
Yep.
classified as having an eating disorder because they're by and large like in a larger body and don't meet that underweight criteria. But what they're doing tends to be very, mimic or be very similar to the
Yep.
behaviors of someone with an eating disorder. So but in terms of like when people come in and they're really invested in dieting and like they want to be that successful person, I mean, we all have body autonomy. We can do, that's fine if that's what they want to
Yeah.
do. I often talk to people about their past experiences and just like how has dieting served them, and how has it not, and how has it created issues in
Yeah.
their life, and what are they looking for from dieting, or what are they looking for from weight loss, and is there another way to help them work towards those goals now, independent of what might happen with their body.
Right. Yeah, I think there's such a drive to prove something about yourself when that has that big of an appeal. Even just getting curious about what am I trying to prove and what are some other ways to go about filling this need or void or whatever it is. Because in those moments, I feel like the people who tend to express that are also like high achievers, who are essentially elite. Being elite in one way or another is very important. And this just happens to be a way. And it's, of course, backed with diet culture in general, but it holds appeal not because it just feels possible that there's some people who can do it. It holds appeal because only a special few supposedly are being able to do it. But yeah, having worked in the fitness industry and as a personal trainer, I was one of those people who lowered my weight through behaviors for a sustained long-term amount of time because it was directly linked to my career, my training. I was tracking macros, doing the whole thing, but it felt authentic to me because of the space I was in and the values that I was, sort of pursuing at the time. But looking back, I'm like, oh yeah, that's every single thing that led to that was a disordered behavior. So even though it seemed to sort of inspire people, that's like just as dark and dangerous to say that I would have been considered part of the 5% if I'd been included in a study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
All right. This is kind of a silly question. But why isn't information enough? Like, so many clients can read the anti-diet books, the information, the idea that diets don't work, and still say, but it's not changing anything. I still feel how I feel. I still want what I want. Why isn't enough? Is it not enough to change our thoughts or beliefs about this if diet culture is kind of what gets us into it?
Yeah, I love that question because I think you're so spot on. And I think it's because our investment in diet culture and our relationship with food by and large is not rational. It's not something that is about just like getting the right information, or
Yeah.
like, I mean, again, I think the research is important. I think the information is important, and it's often not enough because that connection with our body, the internalizations of what it means to be a certain size in our culture, the internalizations of what it means to like deprive yourself of food, of having pleasure in food, like all of that can become so core, and a lot of it is internalized at like almost
Yeah.
like pre-verbal, ages. Like it's internalized so early. And that's one of the reasons that I really love mindfulness, is because
Mm,
it's not a, it's about doing. Mindfulness is a state of
yep.
being. It's not about understanding something. It's not about having all the information or the knowledge. Oftentimes people come to me, and when we start to talk about mindfulness, they're like, do I really have to do the meditation? Or
Yeah.
why am I meditating? I'm here to see you to help me, with my relationship with food. Why am I sitting here, focusing on my breath for 3 minutes every day? And it's okay if they don't understand. I can try to understand, I can
Yeah.
try to explain the research behind it. And there is a ton of research behind the power of mindfulness, but it's about doing. It's about just like
Yeah.
being in that experience, and you will start to know and understand why that's important. And I think that shifting our relationship with food is so much in that experiential part, like, and in my course we do a lot of like mindful eating exercises where we walk people through it. And like,
Mm.
again, you don't have to understand from a rational perspective, but starting to have those experiences, I think, changes something.
What's an example of a mindful eating exercise?
So we might like do something, like in the course we have exercises where we might, kind of walk you through mindfully eating certain types of foods. So it would be kind of
Mm.
taking a few moments to get centered. And then, if you're, say we're doing a mindful eating exercise with a piece of chocolate, it might be starting
Sure.
to just like look at it, bring it up to your nose, smelling it. And then also thinking about like all the stuff that comes up. So walking you through the whole
Yeah.
process.
Understood. Okay, cool. Yeah. So essentially, what you're saying is you can learn all the stuff. It doesn't get into your body, which is where the baggage is, right? Like it's not an issue of rationality. It lives in the subconscious mind or in the body, in the feeling space. And so doing the mindfulness stuff, it's not that they're going to sit there and feel different, but over time there's going to be a different approach, or I don't know how you would describe that. There's a different what?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I love about mindfulness is that it's really not just about changing the way that you relate to food, but it's about changing the way that you relate to yourself and to the world around you. So when
Mhm.
we can start to shift from kind of that automatic part of our brain that keeps us so looped in to, worrying about the future, worrying about the past, thinking about things that we have no control over,
Yeah.
um, we're able to come into the present moment. And from there, mindfulness is linked with also like, I think when we're able to be present and actually like fully experience life as it's coming at us, there's so much gratitude that comes in. There's so much more
Mm.
compassion. I think there's like innately we feel more connected with other people because we're actually there in the
Right.
moments with them in the room. And we feel more connected with ourselves because we're there being present with ourselves. And I think that's all experiential, and, some of the ways that mindfulness can really shift everything.
Yeah. It's also interesting because learning to be present with positive experiences, I feel like this goes against what you might imagine before you start that, like, oh, sure, being present with negative experiences, that's obviously going to be hard and challenging, but being with positive feelings or pleasure, that's going to be easy. But it's really not. And it's not something that we generally have learned to build a decent capacity or tolerance for. So learning to be with both builds self-trust and like the sense that future you will be okay. Future you will be able to access the positive feelings and tolerate the negative feelings. Like it really does shift how you move through the world and make you feel safer just to know that if you can be here now, you'll probably be able to be here then. Which is massive for people who have learned to fear themselves, right? Like their own feelings, good or bad.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that there's, something that we don't think about and including how it impacts our relationship with food and bodies is, the way that we experience pleasure in our culture and the ways
Mm,
that that has been so kind of demonized. And, we've been taught that like pleasure is sinful and we should feel guilty about it and all that
right.
stuff. And that certainly comes up a ton around, food and our bodies.
What are some ways that that comes up that you see most often?
I mean, I think that, oftentimes, for example, with food, if there's something that's enjoyable or that we're getting pleasure from, it feels like that's bad. We shouldn't be eating that,
Hmm.
right? And I think that's labeled in our culture, the sinful this, the guilt,
Yeah.
guilty pleasures, like all
Snackwell
of that stuff.
culture is like
Yeah, yeah.
sin-free
Um,
cookies.
yeah, but I think we also really internalize that. I mean, I think that there's, especially for people living in larger bodies, there's can be so much
Mhm.
shame associated with having pleasure from food, which is like the most normal and human experience. Like our body, again, our bodies are hardwired to have pleasure from food because that's what motivates us to eat and keep our body nourished and alive. And yet
Right.
somehow we're taught that it's bad and that we should feel like ashamed of ourselves if we are enjoying something.
That's interesting because I certainly think and talk to clients a lot about like the overlap between things like, patriarchy and purity culture with pleasure and food.
Mhm.
But being in a larger body obviously is going to bring up a completely different source of guilt or shame for feeling pleasure. Do you think you could like describe where that one comes from? Like what is the message underneath that for someone in a large body who's feeling bad about enjoying food?
Well, I mean, I can speak from my experience as a
Yeah.
therapist, having worked with people. One thing that I hear a lot is the idea that, you know, being in a larger body kind of can make you more visible, both more visible and invisible. And there's really this sense that, people attribute, and there's research about this too, that you must be, gluttonous, you have no self-control, you're,
Right.
indulgent, all of these things, again, I think very like associated with like puritanical culture and our,
Yeah.
value on like discipline and hard work and morality. And that, pleasure I think gets like muddled in there, that like, you're too fat because you eat too much, because you enjoy, you have no self-control, you have no discipline, you just,
Right.
are kind of a glutton. I
Totally.
think.
It's like it's exactly the same then as far as like shaming. The word slut basically means you enjoy sex too much, right? Like the word
Mhm,
glutton means you enjoy food too much. It's you're taking too much pleasure from something that should be, sparse
mhm,
and disciplined and for fuel or whatever.
mhm. Yeah, and it comes up, like you're saying, with sex as well. And I think that, a lot of people, a lot of us have kind of learned that, any kind of pleasure, is bad. And there's some interesting research actually linking, um, like masturbation and body image, and seeing that
Yeah.
people who have better body image tend to masturbate more. And I think it's like linked with like viewing your, body as a source of pleasure actually makes us feel better about our
Right.
body. Right. And I think when we're caught in that conflict, as many people who
Yeah.
struggle with eating disorders and disordered eating are, it's so hard to see your body as a source of pleasure, whether it's for sex or from food or anything else.
Yeah. And then when you have so little pleasure, then the tiny pockets that you allow it or it just happens are going to again take up way more
Mhm.
significance and feel way more important. So sometimes I talk to people who are like moving away from binge behaviors and they're like nothing else feels as good as that. And I'm like,
Mhm.
yeah, and that might actually just be true forever. Just like someone who is addicted to, a drug or something, they might never get 15 needs met by one substance ever again, right? Like it might be a lot more diverse from here on, a lot more subtle from here on. It is better and it is worth it, but it's a major loss when you have that association with something being like your number one only tool that brings you all the pleasure, all the fun, all the joy, all the freedom, all the whatever it might feel like.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the biggest, I don't want to say mistakes, but things that I see come up with some therapists, or the way even some people try to think about binge eating and how to kind of stop the binge. And that's the last, I mean, in my work with people, that's kind of the last step, because there's so much work that we can do to
Hmm.
around the binge eating cycle, that's not just about trying to white knuckle it and take away something that feels like something they need for self-care, for pleasure,
Of
for
course.
whatever. But I see so many, again, I think it's linked in with diet culture, like so many kind of self-help programs, or
Yeah.
even sometimes therapists who are in super knowledgeable about binge eating. It's just about like, okay, how can we avoid the binge? And there's so much loss and grief associated with that.
Hmm.
And we come to it when the time is right in the
Yep.
process, but for that to be the first thing, it's like, know it just doesn't make sense to me, and is
No,
not effective.
it's not. I was gonna say. I mean, it's utterly ineffective, but it's also so harmful because it puts you back in a restrictive place, which is going to
Hmm.
keep this thing happening. And also it's so threatening to the system.
Hmm.
Just like
Hmm.
if, I don't know, you're a cigarette smoker and the only option for you, they're like, we're throwing it all away and locking you in your house. Like there are other ways of doing this so that it
Hmm.
feels gentler and safer to the system. And I see that all the time, obviously, in the coaching industry and the um, nutrition and wellness and all of those places. It's like how to stop binging. I'm like, I will never talk to someone about how to stop binging. I
Hmm.
will talk to you about why you binge and how to have more compassion for it. And most of the time, it does slow down and feel more spacious until you don't need it as much. But just even literally talking about it through that lens makes those same practices less effective and
Hmm.
scarier.
Yeah.
So tell me about radical self acceptance, because this is in the title of your book and we haven't
Hmm.
quite touched on it. How do you define it? What does it mean? What are you talking about when you say radical self acceptance?
So radical self-acceptance is the idea of, you know, opening your eyes to the reality of what you are now in this moment. People often mistake acceptance as liking, and we don't, they're not the same thing,
Ooh,
right? So acceptance is, this is where I am, this is who I am, and ideally trying to bring a sense of compassion towards yourself in that moment. What do I need in this moment? How can I move forward in my own best interests? We can do that even when we don't like something. We can do that, even if we want to change something. But acceptance
yeah.
is just about right now in this moment. This is the way that things are.
Yeah. It's pretty astonishing to realize how much friction we create in our lives by having a preference for reality to be different and then like sitting inside that and feeling all the feelings about that. That's just how it should be. I don't like it.
Hmm. Yeah,
Um
and and I think that we can. Again, this is, I think, something that people really miss. Like, we can accept something even when we don't like it, even when we hate it,
yeah.
even when we're unhappy with it. But it's that fighting against, it's that feeling of like, it's not okay for me to be this way, that I think gets us so stuck, because we're not starting in reality,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, I have worked with so many people who feel, I can't do X, Y, or Z until I've lost weight. And
Right.
we're just living on pause, like you're just waiting for this thing to happen that may or may not ever happen. But what
Right.
about now? Like, what are you losing now in that time?
Yeah. So what do you see changing for someone who's making the shift of uh I guess self-rejection or whatever the sort of opposite would be into self-acceptance? What do you see materially changing in their body image, in their life? Like what's different as they move through that process?
So I think that, one of the things that naturally comes with more self-acceptance, and that I also try to build and support in my clients, is self-compassion. And that's kind of coming to ourselves from a more gentle place, a place of unconditional love. I talk a lot about loving ourselves, and how, loving our body again, I think people get kind of misled that like loving our body means that we have to like the way that our body looks. And
Yeah.
again, to me, that is something totally different. Loving our body is a deep, unconditional sense of love to ourselves, the kind of love that we might have towards a child or a pet or a family member or a
Yeah.
beloved friend, like, and bringing that to ourselves so that we can love ourselves even when we don't like what's going on. I
Yeah.
think most of us can imagine a relationship where we deeply love a person, and do we like everything that they do? Certainly not, right? But that foundational sense of love of wanting the
Yeah.
best for them kind of carries you through those difficult moments, and that's really what we want to try to build for our body, which is again totally separate from what our body looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. It's about honoring that you and your body are worthy no matter how you look rather than saying, okay, I mean, it's that conditional thing of, okay, I love you today because of how you look, but I won't love you tomorrow if you change.
Right? Would any of us want to be with a partner who was
Right.
like that?
Nope. So in terms of the compassion piece, is that something that you have specific practices for, or do you find that the compassion just tends to tag along with like the mindfulness and the acceptance work?
So I find that it all kind of comes together through this process. I mean, so much of it is, again, building that mindfulness meditation practice and then integrating that observation. I call them mindful moments into our day. So, just those little pauses where we're noticing, oh, I'm really anxious right now, or oh, I'm really having a lot of diet culture thoughts, or this is really uncomfortable, this is hard.
Yeah.
When we are able to recognize that, and then I often tell people to kind of pause, take a deep breath, create some space in there if you can, and reflect on, what's going on and how can I move forward in a way that feels the best possible. What do I deeply need right now in this moment? And
Yeah.
that is starting to build that self-compassion, that kind of that care for ourselves where we can pause and think about, how can
Yeah.
I best take care of myself? And when we treat ourselves lovingly, sometimes that can start to build a sense of love for ourselves, even if we don't feel it internally as well. Sometimes we have to kind of treat ourselves like we do before we can
Hmm.
really build that.
I love that. So, what would you recommend to a listener who's like, all this sounds great. Where do I start? I would obviously recommend your book. Is there anything else that you recommend for people who are just starting out on this process or looking for resources?
Yeah, so I have some free resources on my website. You can go to drconason.com, and I have a free mindful eating toolkit where we
Amazing.
kind of go through some of the basics of that 3-minute meditation. There's a mindful eating exercise, so you can try that and see what that feels like. Um, yeah,
Love
and
that.
some journaling and like some information about diet culture and why that's not going to lead us in the right
Yeah.
direction. So, but and then aside from that, like for meditation, I think it's something that we can just start doing it again, even if you don't fully understand, even if you're not 100% sold. There's so many apps and things. I
Yeah.
have the free meditation on my website, but there's so many different ways to access meditation, including just setting a timer for 3 minutes and focusing on your breath. But for people just starting to build a meditation practice, I do think the guided meditations can be helpful just to kind of remind us, to focus on our breath and to
Yeah.
normalize. Most of the meditations that I recommend, including the one that I put on my website, really talk about that process of like your mind wandering off and bringing it back, and that being an inherent and natural part of meditation. I think that's really
Yeah.
important for people to hear, because I hear so often people say like, oh, I'm meditating wrong, I can't meditate, my mind keeps wandering off.
Yeah.
That's part of the process, like that's to be expected.
Yeah. Awesome. I love that. And if people just want to follow up with you, find you, learn from you in other places on the internet, where should they go?
Yeah, so I'm active on Instagram at the anti-diet plan. My website, drconason.com. And then if you're in New York and looking for in-person therapy, or if you are in New York State, Florida, Vermont, or Connecticut, we offer virtual therapy through my group practice, Conason Psychological Services.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here, Alexis. This was awesome. I think there's tons of great insights and resources packed in this episode that are going to help a lot of people. So I really appreciate you being here. Anything else that we haven't covered or that you want to share?
No, thank you for opening up this conversation. It was really nice to be able to share this today.
Awesome. And to any listeners out there, thank you for being here. I hope this was helpful. You can always get in touch, DM me on Instagram, share feedback, make recommendations, ask questions, whatever you like. And thank you for being here, and I'll catch you next week. Hi everyone, I'm Jessie Nealand. I just want to take a moment to thank you for watching this video. I put out new episodes of my podcast every Tuesday, so be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so that you don't miss those, and feel free to leave me a comment. If you are looking for more information about body neutrality or you want to work with me, you can always find me at my website, jessienealand.com, or you can purchase my book, Body Neutral, A Revolutionary Guide to Overcoming Body Image Issues, wherever you buy books, ebooks, or audiobooks. We can also connect on Instagram or TikTok. My handle is Jessie Nealand. And I make this podcast for free and without any sponsors or ads. So if you want to support my show, you can use the Patreon link in the show notes, and know that your support is always very much appreciated. Lastly, thank you to my brother, Jason Nealand, for creating the music that plays at the beginning of the show. And thank you for listening, learning, and moving toward personal and collective body liberation.